Hello and welcome to Scale by Design. Today we are joined by Anisha Nandi. Anisha, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, James.
Yeah, for sure. Before we jump into it, could you just share a little bit about your background and experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I founded Verbate, really, the typical story of kind of built the tool that I wish that I had, as well as my co-founder. I actually come from the corporate media world. I worked a lot in digital newsrooms, and was really passionate about the idea of really bringing your whole self to work, right? I thought it always made our business better. It made me better. It made my teams better. And then the shift to distributed work happened. And of course, every workplace was trying to figure out, what does that mean? How can we really keep our people connected and have that sense of community and still bringing themselves to work in their fullest sense? And so my days in the corporate media world, really managing different folks and different types of team dynamics. And then my co-founder's experience over in the tech world, we both saw this enormous opportunity specifically within employee resource groups to fuel that mission. And so Verbate was born.
That's awesome. And so at your prior employers before you started your own company, like NBC, CBS, did they all have ERGs? Is that accurate? Is that where you kind of learn more about them and where you saw
Yeah.
opportunity?
Yeah, totally. So especially at NBC, we had a pretty robust ERG program, and even at the Comcast level as well. There's a lot of different communities, networks, employee resource groups. Specifically, I was involved with our AAPI resource group, employee resource group over at NBC News. Personally, I'm Trinidadian and Indian. I was born in England. I grew up in New York, and so I really have this kind of multitude of different identities. And especially as a journalist, you want to bring that with you to work, right? It makes your, like I said, team stronger. It makes the stories that you pitch even richer. It gives you just a perspective on the world that's really valuable. And to be honest with you, as a journalist, I was always figuring out how to do more of that. So I was involved with that ERG. I think what's really interesting is we're seeing more and more of these groups pop up that encompass more and more of your identity and experience, right? Personally, I never really had a group to represent my Trinidadian identity, right? And so I think what's really interesting is as we talk to more companies, we're seeing them really expand the scope and the size of these groups, right? Almost every company we talk to is also launching a parents group or a mental health group. And so it's really becoming an amazing way to bring more and more of yourself to work.
Yeah, for sure. And so I've actually heard like a lot of mixed reviews about ERGs. Like I've heard from some people that, their company had a really incredible ERG group that was actually producing like good outcomes for employees. And then I've also heard other situations in which they're like really not properly run and there's just really nobody qualified leading the charge. So I'm just kind of curious, like, is your product, does it help companies run ERGs effectively so it's actually producing the outcomes that are why like the group is started, or is it more of like just more so compliance, or like what?
Yeah, it's a
I yeah, like how does it, where do you see like the biggest like, is that part of the gap that you're solving for?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot in there to unpack, and I'll kind of start with where we see the trend lines moving and why we even started Verbate. So what we saw happening across so many different industries, across so many different companies, my co-founder and I talked to tons of people leaders and CEOs, and when there was a shift to distributed and hybrid work, almost every single company was rethinking, how do we keep people connected? How do we have that sense of community at work? Especially when we can't come into the office anymore, right? We can't have cold brew and beautiful offices be what's bringing people together. What can we do? And pretty universally, we heard a lot of companies, not surprisingly, doubling down on employee resource groups in some way, shape, or form, because it was, a lot of companies already had ERGs and they were like, oh, this is the natural place where we can foster a sense of community. To your point, though, a lot of these groups are bootstrapped, right? I mean, you have volunteer employees running them who are giving extra time on top of their original function. Maybe they're a product manager or an engineer or a CX person in their team. And now they're dedicating extra time as a lead to run the ERG. And so the number one word we hear from that group of folks is burnout, right? This is a lot of work to take on. And from those company leaders, to be frank with you, a lot of the time they were just like, we have no way to actually, we're doubling down, we're giving them budgets, we're giving them more of the engagement budget, et cetera, but we don't know how to measure success, right? Like we don't know how to know if they're doing all of the great things we think they are. So that's really where we come in, is that sense of alignment, giving the ERG leads better automation, integration tools, like really just being able to just do the work easier, save them time and money. And then we give the company leaders that sense of alignment so they can understand like what impact these groups are having.
For sure. And are you seeing ERGs are typically at larger companies, right? Like, do you work with startups and growth stage companies, or is it primarily like established mid-market enterprise orgs?
Honestly, it's everybody. We have talked to companies that have 200 employees that have 8 ERGs. It's now every single company has either started an ERG program or has had one for decades. And the term that we hear a lot is ERG 2.0 from those legacy type of companies. They're like, we've had a women's group and a Black group and an LGBTQ plus group and a parents group forever. Now we want to add 4 more and make sure that they feel really robust again and aligned with the company's initiatives. But then from the smaller orgs and the startups, we hear like, we know we have to do this. We want to do it right from the start. And ironically, both of those groups are going to come to a platform like Verbate and kind of have the same basic needs of like alignment and organization and collaboration.
Okay, cool. So at this point, it sounds like are you pretty much targeting the entire market, or do you have kind of like an ideal customer profile that you're really focused on getting started with right now?
Yeah, so we started with like 500 to 2,000 person employee companies, mainly in the tech sector. And those folks loved us, right? They're very forward thinking. Like I said, they already had ERGs or they were launching ERGs. What's been really surprising and really interesting for us is we've been getting a lot more interest, both inbound and outbound, from those more legacy companies, manufacturing, corporate media, pharmaceutical companies that are having that kind of like ERG 2.0 problem where they're like, we need to revamp these groups and make sure that they're at the center of our culture and strategy.
Okay, cool. Nice. Well, that sounds really cool. And I think probably in the enterprise space too, right? Like
Totally.
there's going to be a huge demand for this. So is the idea to kind of like, as the product continues to mature, to kind of like push up market to those Fortune 500 orgs as well?
Yeah, I think so. So for us, we have been getting some inbound from some of those folks already, and we're
Oh, that's
doing some
cool.
early exploration on just like, what does it mean to serve those Fortune 500 type companies? It's an exciting thing to be seeing happening. For us, our ICP is more in like the 500 all the way up to like 20K, 20K employees.
Sure.
So that's been interesting. I think the real kind of requirement for us that we often see our product really hitting the nail on the head, if we can have that in our customer profile, is having that DEIB program manager in seat. So that's actually the second fastest growing role in America right now. And this person is basically being tasked with managing the ERG program at large. And so knowing that program manager is there and doing the work, that's really kind of our one requirement, or at least one like thing that we really love to see at a company that's going to work with us.
Okay, that's really cool. And that's also something you can put into like a data tool to come up with target accounts, right? Where you can actually specifically target that profile.
Yeah.
For outreach. So that makes it, that's good.
100%. You can do that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that we're really excited about is like that person, that program manager that's really focused on ERGs at the company and a lot of the DEIB initiatives that are going on, that person feels really alone right now. They really need a sense of community. They want to connect with other people in the space. And so we're working a lot on creating that sense of community for them as well.
Okay, nice. So I think just, given kind of our theme of the show, which is figuring out how to do things at scale, right?
Yeah.
How should companies think about scaling ERGs? I mean, we've gone into this a little bit, like in terms of the 2.0, working, obviously leveraging technology to produce better outcomes. But, what are some of the first things that you kind of recommend to companies when they're thinking about taking ERG to the next level? Or maybe what are some of the core product features that you have that enable them to do so? Like what's the focus, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So our two main like super users are that program manager that sits a kind of a bird's eye view of all of the ERGs at a company and is tasked with managing them and understanding their success. And then the next super user is really that ERG lead. They're the ones that are doing the work kind of off the side of their desk, and they really need a better way to just manage that work and make it more efficient and even level it up in terms of strategy. So with those two users in mind, there's really a couple things that are really important that we talk to companies about when they think about how can we scale our ERGs. One is that sense of alignment, right? You touched on it earlier. we really emphasize that you have to have that sense of alignment across the board, both for the ERG leads, your program manager, and your executive leadership, right? What do you want from your ERGs? What are your goals for them? Do you want them to help with retention or engagement? And if so, how can you start to build up to that? And how can you build almost an OKR style framework around what that actually looks like? And so one of the things we do in platform is, we actually help them set goals and we help them ladder up to them so that everybody is consistently aligned across the board.
So is that like, it's almost like performance management for ERGs?
Yeah, a little bit, definitely.
Okay. So that is that kind of the analogy you sometimes use, or?
We often say we're like the operating system for employee resource groups. So everything from, down to budget tracking, all the way up to goal alignment. We kind of help them put it all in one place so that you can essentially tell that story around what are these groups doing for our business, right? I think that that's a really important part that honestly, sometimes people are a little bit scared to tackle, is like, how is it being tied to business imperatives, right? At the end of the day, these groups are functioning within a business that has to generate profit and revenue. And how can we contribute in a way that feels authentic, both to the group, but also to the business? And that's kind of, we like to create that alignment.
Yeah. It's like, how do you connect values with business outcomes, right? Like
exactly.
Right. Yeah. So it's almost like Lattice for ERGs.
Yeah, we think about Lattice a lot because I think they did a similar thing where they took something that people were like, oh, this is obviously important to our business, but we can be doing so much more with this, right? Performance management was something that maybe people weren't thinking as deeply about, right? So yeah, there's a lot to be done. I think that the goal structure is really interesting. Even being able to, the granular level of being able to track goals that both, like I said, feel good to the ERG and to that manager is so important. And it's just not happening a lot of the time. And the wonderful thing that happens is you start to see a flywheel of, once you can give that program manager that bird's eye view and also that sense of alignment, you start to collect some data as well around membership growth or engagement, et cetera. And you start to be able to tell this really beautiful quantitative and qualitative story about what these ERGs are doing.
Okay. So basically a ERG business outcome that you can produce is like, potentially how are ERGs in our organization helping us increase tenure, for instance, right?
Totally.
Or possibly even just like down the pipe employee performance reviews, right? If you have a more engaged employee base, they're probably going to be able to contribute more to the organization as well, right?
Right.
I mean, is that kind of like typically like the business use case, or like what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, right? So big companies, especially, we're talking about enterprise clients, right? A lot of big companies that have had ERGs forever have already been drawing those lines between those dots for ages. So for example, AT&T credits their Black ERG, I think they call it the network, with being really closely tied to helping their underrepresented, specifically a lot of their Black employees, be better retained, be better engaged, as well as have leadership opportunities, right? I think the stat that they like to flout is like 85.6% of their Black employees are retained. That's their retention rate, right? And the network, which is their Black ERG, has 11,000 members. And so they are able to kind of tie that together. Like this is one of the things we do to support them, right? And so we've seen big companies really be able to kind of draw those lines between dots. What we're trying to do is basically bring that level of granularity, some of that data, some of that storytelling to everybody else that maybe just launched their ERGs or is really trying to revamp them. Because right now, to be honest with you, that business case is really fuzzy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of companies like probably don't even know where to start.
Yeah, 100%. And again, the fact that they're not doing basic things like even really setting goals or tracking budget, right? Like it just feels really overwhelming for a lot of folks, especially that program manager that a lot of the time is coming over from like an HRBP role or a recruiting role, and they've never really had to do a job like this before. And so being able to give them that level of guidance and some of that like framework and some of those best practices is really valuable.
Okay. So yeah, this brings structure to the role, it sounds like, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because it's a developing role. I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out like, what are the best ways to do this? And a lot of the times we'll talk to big companies that have even been doing ERGs really well, quote unquote. And they're like, I don't know either. I'm still figuring it out. So I think there's a lot of greenfield to just like really rethink how these groups can be looked at.
So what about like, is there like a compliance layer to this?
In what sense? In terms of like from our perspective for the ERGs or?
Yeah, like running ERGs. And yeah, I guess like does your product, if there is, does your product kind of consider that? I'm just wondering, so these large companies, is there a compliance aspect to it?
Yeah, I think I think it's always something we're thinking about and keeping in the back of our head. I think one of the things that we think deeply about in terms of like what is that next iteration after we can give that structure to a lot of different companies and really create a well-run, well-aligned program. What we actually hear a lot as like that next step for ERGs is plugging them not just into your retention and engagement strategy, but also into other parts of your business, right? So we hear a lot of people talk about, how can our ERGs or communities impact our product, right? Directly. How can it impact our marketing? How can they impact our marketing strategy? How can they impact our corporate social responsibility strategy? And so that's where a lot of thinking, our thinking at least, goes in terms of like what comes next for these groups once you can really supercharge them.
Okay, cool. And you think typically companies are starting to look at this at like the 500 employee range? Is that when
When we typically see them start a program?
Yeah.
Yeah, usually it's really interesting. I mean, we have that 500 mark as like when you definitely have an ERG program, if
For
not
sure.
are thinking about it. Like at that point, you've either considered it or you're definitely trying to launch one. But again, we've seen like really young companies. We've talked to one of the interesting trends that we're just seeing from our own conversations is like really young crypto companies, especially, are very forward thinking and are launching ERGs with even just 80 employees, right? And
Yeah.
it's anytime they reach a critical mass of like, hey, we have a few different, groups naturally forming in Slack channels or whatever it may be. Maybe they're interest-based groups, right? Maybe it's all the folks that really love a certain activity. Maybe it's all the groups that live in Brooklyn, right? And so it's like, it's interesting to see these trends develop. And while 500 is a mark where it's like, you're absolutely thinking about it, we see companies as young as 50 to 80 employees thinking about it too.
Yeah, I think I definitely could see though the 500 mark. It makes sense to me also just in terms of companies having the budget and bandwidth,
Right.
right? Because it's like if you're so for instance, like we're 40 people all in.
Right.
Like we just don't have like the resources to like I don't have the time to be focused on that because I'm focusing on growing the business and we don't have the budget to have somebody, dedicated to that, right? So
Yeah, fair enough.
uh
And you probably already, especially at like 40, right? You probably already have a lot of those natural connections just happening given the
yeah.
size of the organization, right?
Yeah,
So
I
it's
think so. I think conversations are kind of happening on the side, right?
right.
But it's just not like a formal like company sponsored type of deal. If that
Right.
makes
But I think you're right. I think
Yeah.
naturally it's just like the human component of like a lot of these groups will form naturally once you reach like that 200 to 500 mark.
Right.
Then it's also, of course, the business case of like the bigger companies are probably going to have the budget for it. They're going to have that program manager in seat. They're probably just going to already be putting that a little bit of that structure in place and realizing like, oh, if we're going to do this right, we need to be able to like set this up sustainably.
What goes into the budget? Is it primarily just like the person overseeing the ERGs, or is there other kind of expenses to kind of factor in? Well, I guess like your product, right? But like,
Yeah, I mean,
right,
right. That's
right,
definitely part of it.
right, right, right.
I mean, yeah, just right off the bat, increasingly are seeing like software, any type of tooling be factored in. It's just becoming
Okay.
increasingly clear, especially in like a hybrid work world. Like it is too much to manage if you're just doing it the old way, which I'm not kidding you, is like a 70-page Google Doc and like 15 Slack channels. And to be honest, when these groups were, maybe throwing a happy hour or planning a couple things here and there, that was fine, right? Like that was a fine amount of structure. But if you are going to expect them to influence retention and engagement, recruiting is one we hear a lot, right? Even product and marketing, you need to give them a little bit more infrastructure. But yeah, that being said, it's an interesting move to see that engagement budget kind of like shift to these groups increasingly.
For sure. So do you think the person overseeing ERGs, should they be held accountable to business outcomes? Like if they're running the programs, like, do you feel like that should be a performance driven role, or is it more of just like, let's support these
I
different
certainly
groups?
think it can't hurt, right? Like
Yeah.
I think that there is definitely a split sometimes on how to think about it. This work is hard, especially it's a lot of the time when we talk to customers, one of the things that I deeply understand is as a woman of color who is involved or in building these programs sometimes is it's emotional work, right? Like it's literally your identity and people's experiences coming to work with them. And so you have to be sensitive around making sure that you're dealing with that with the amount of care that it deserves. But also to your point, if you are going to assign a role, if you are going to say this program manager, again, second fastest growing role in America, second only to vaccine specialist, right?
Oh,
If
wow.
that person, yeah, I love, that's like my favorite fun fact. I'm like, we'll take a backseat to vaccine specialist. But yeah, this person's really rapidly being hired into this role. If you want them to be able to say, hey, my job is super important to this company, it can never hurt to be able to say, hey, this is how it actually ties to business outcomes. This is how it ties to making our business stronger. So that's kind of the way we see it. And also I wanted to mention to your earlier question as well, that budget is also broken down into things like, increasingly each ERG has a budget anywhere from a few $1,000s all the way up to, we've heard of like tens of thousands of dollars. At some big companies, it's up to 100 grand, right? Because they also have different chapters regionally. So each ERG has their own budget to do their different initiatives and events. You have the program manager that's obviously part of that budget line item, hopefully a software tool like Verbate. And then also, increasingly they're dealing with your engagement team, your recruitment team, all of these different teams to make sure that the idea of inclusion and belonging is at the center of everything.
Nice. Very cool. How does it influence product and marketing? I'm just curious, like, do you have any examples of that you can share?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So there's a couple kind of really obvious ways that we always hear. For product, focus groups is a big one, right? So if you are thinking about a specific feature or a new line of product that you want to launch, these groups are really valuable to tap into, being that they have, this aggregated form of experience or identity internally at your company that you can trust, right? We've heard of big clothing retail companies really tapping into their women's group to understand like, different ways that they might want to both build a product around it, but then also market it, right? That's another big one we hear is like marketing campaigns, how to tap into these groups as well. The recruiting is a big sector we hear a lot as well, is like really using ERGs and different communities within your company to reach underrepresented recruits or underrepresented groups of people that you might want to tap more into. And then the other big one we always hear is like corporate social responsibility, right? Using these groups to really inform your giving or volunteering strategy.
Okay, yeah, for sure. I could totally see that. Like, I could definitely see it from a talent acquisition perspective and employee engagement and retention. Like that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. I love the idea too of like tying it to business outcomes, because it's like this, like we're here to work and do a job. And so how does it correlate to, what we're doing on a day-to-day basis at the work, right? At the business.
And in an ideal world, it should make sense to all of the parties involved, right? That alignment. Like another interesting thing we always hear is like, sometimes these groups are influencing policy. Right now, a lot of parents groups are helping their companies craft, policy around caregiving or leave for new parents, right? And so it's like to be able to tap into that group in your organization and say, hey, help us come to the table and help us craft something that feels good for everybody.
Right. Like part of like the benefits plan, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's just so many ways that, again, once you like create those different swim lanes and those different ways to be able to have that conversation, it really becomes something that is super powerful for everybody involved.
Yeah, I mean, and the benefits plan is another way it directly impacts talent acquisition, right? Like when you're making offers to candidates and they're asking like, okay, like what are the benefits and perks of working here? Yeah. That's a huge driver of why people accept offers.
100%. And it's all really tied together, right? One of the things that we're seeing so much is like, if you go to pretty much any company's recruitment page today, like their ERGs are the second or third, modular chunk on their recruiting page, right? Because then you can link out to so many other things that they do for the company, or you can talk about, like you said, benefits. It's such a great way to show like we care about our employees and we understand that y'all have needs outside of work and inside of work that we can acknowledge.
So quick kind of like side question that I think somewhat correlated, but have you heard of like personalized benefits plans where it's like there's a whole range of benefits that you can choose from and you can kind of decide what you want? Like, do you want, more stock options, or do you want, more in terms of kind of credits or whatever it might be for childcare? Do you feel like this kind of the ERG concept kind of also plays into the concept of personalized benefits, or just kind of curious to get your thoughts that if you have any opinions there?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, I mean, you're definitely hitting on why we get so excited about this space is there really are just so many opportunities from here. So it's definitely something we've thought about. It's something that potential customers and folks have floated to us as a way that ERGs could integrate into their systems. I think today we're very laser focused on like that infrastructure layer, even at a baseline level of just like make sure people feel aligned across the board, and then it's greenfield from here. But I think today it's just like there's such a level of disorganization, if I can be honest with you, at a lot of companies, and confusion, that getting that like baseline infrastructure is necessary to unlock any of those other things.
Yeah, I totally see that. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, just based on what you're saying. So one of the things we wanted to talk about today was just really talking about the products, right? Trying to figure out where to start, right? And what are most important, and how are you thinking about products roadmap at this point? Like, obviously you're thinking about the infrastructure layer, you're thinking about the core outcomes that companies need to produce. So what's next? Like, how do you see the product continuing to evolve
Yeah.
at this point?
I'm gonna steal one of my co-founders' favorite points to always make here. He comes from the fintech world, so he comes over from Betterment. And one of the things that was really powerful over there is the idea of really democratizing access to not only financial systems but also advice, right? I think it was one of those fields that was just, again, very confusing, and people were like, I don't know if I have access to the best way to think about this, right? And a lot of that kind of thinking applies to still what we're doing today in the DEIB space and the ERG space. For us on our product roadmap today, again, that infrastructure, that baseline level of alignment, of collaboration, of workflows is so necessary. But what we're layering on top of it today and next in our roadmap is that sense of guidance, right? Not only can we give you the best practices in the workflows and the templates and the integrations, but we're also going to be kind of helping you think through, what should I be thinking about? What should I be doing? What should our ERGs be influencing product? Or maybe we're not ready for that yet, right? And so for us, that's a lot of the stuff that's happening in app, but it's also happening through our community efforts and through our ways that we're connecting folks just in these efforts that we're doing, both for our growth marketing, but then also just to have people feel supported in the space. And then in the long term, we're really forming our thesis around some of those larger kind of business strategy items that these ERGs can plug into. But honestly, I think everybody needs a little bit more infrastructure before they can get there yet.
Yeah, for sure. So I feel like one of the ways you could help guide them in terms of what outcomes they need to produce is through reporting, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can
Oh,
just say,
absolutely.
in terms of the templated reports that you put in could be based around the criteria that, you feel to be most important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're reading our product roadmap a little bit here, but that's one of those areas that every customer is so excited about, right? Even just to be able to say, hey, let's look at what's going on in our ERGs, click export, and you can see how membership has grown, how engagement has grown, maybe start to tie it to some of those retention and engagement numbers. And again, that alignment, right? You can not only show that to your ERG leads, but now your executive sponsors, your CEO, everybody starts to understand, oh, this is why this is amazing. This is why we're doubling down on it. Let's beef up budgets again next year.
For sure. And so so I was actually a recruitment advisor for a company called MTrain, and it was like a culture platform. It did much more than compliance, but they had a mission to end, workplace harassment, discrimination, unconscious bias. And they worked with a lot of enterprise companies. And one of the features that a lot of these organizations were really excited about was this idea of benchmarking. So they would actually share the data in aggregate in terms of the outcomes and the progress that their customers were able to make. And the customers that, obviously like what they were currently doing. I'm just wondering, like, it's obviously not the same thing here, but similar in a sense. So I'm curious, like, have y'all thought of like doing some kind of aggregate data benchmarking, or possibly like selling that separately as like data or something like that?
We've absolutely thought about it. I think it's something that two things come up here. I think one, absolutely something that I think a lot of people would be super interested in.
Yeah, definitely.
Even if you're just thinking, right? Like, if I'm a growth stage company, pre-IPO, I'm in the tech sector and I do A, B, and C, like, I would like to know, am I on the right track? Do other companies of my, shape and size typically have more ERGs, less ERGs? Again, there's just like a lot of confusion in the space, and there's not a lot of connection and understanding of what else is going on. Twofold there, though. I think that a lot of companies, while they do want to see that comparative metric, sometimes if it's too early on in their journey, it's not always helpful, because it's kind of like, oh, well, I'm that company, as great as they are, might not actually know what the answer is either. And so that's why today we've kind of gone the route of like, let's provide some of that guidance and best practices from day one. And as more of the space develops, that benchmarking becomes really interesting. And also the cross-company collaboration, right? A lot of companies want to collaborate with each other. And so again, our brain goes into like network effects land very much so, but there's a lot of exciting stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Cause I could see maybe when the space is a little bit more mature, like this idea of like, since there's a lot of people starting out, it's like, what does good look like?
Yeah,
Like what
absolutely.
outcomes, like what progress should we be making?
Right.
Because I feel like I mean, I guess like you can just say, okay, year over year, quarter over quarter, depending on the size of the company, right? Like
Mhm.
what type of progress are we making here?
Right.
Um, yeah,
I
yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's totally an opportunity for that. And I think I'd be really interested in seeing where we are 5 years even in this space, right? And seeing like, are some of those baselines a little bit more clear? I think today, again, and this was an assumption that even as entrepreneurs we had going into it, I think we thought that a lot of the big companies had that figured out yet. And even I'm not going to name drop anyone, but even some of the companies with the best ERG programs, we've chatted with them and they're still like, we're still figuring it out.
Yeah.
So
How do we
it's a
measure
real signal to
success?
what was that?
It's like, how do we actually measure success? Like,
Exactly, exactly. And I think a big part of that is the timing here, right? I
yeah.
think that so much of the progress that's happened in terms of ERGs really being at the center of culture and strategy happened over a really condensed time period over the past 2 to 3 years, as we all went through that rapid shift to distributed work and a lot of the social movements we saw happened. It just kind of left a lot of companies grappling for answers in a very short period of time. So a lot of folks still feel like they're playing catch up.
Yeah, for sure. I could see like there's so many different features and rollouts you could do for this product. And
Totally.
one of the people that I don't know if you've heard of Pavilion, but it's like a community based company for they have different like they have executive programs. They also have founder CEO programs, by the way, where it's really cool because you can get in a cohort with like, you know, 50 other founder CEOs. And
Interesting.
there's only one person per industry allowed, so you don't have to worry about competitive things. But like it's cool because you can talk with other founder CEOs, and usually we have like the same problems, right? Like we're
Yeah,
dealing with the same stuff. And
totally.
there's CEOs like from different levels of growth. But anyway, Sam Jacobs, he's the founder CEO. And one of the things that I learned from him, he's like talking about experienced operators, right? Like experience, like founders, co-founders. And basically what he's saying is like, people that have been doing this the longest, that are the best at it, they know to do like fewer things, but just over deliver on those things versus do too much stuff, but then provide a crappy experience. So I
Totally.
always thought that that's the hard part, right? Because you could look at all these different applications for your product, but then it's like you don't want to do a bunch of stuff half baked where you don't have the ability to like actually have the budget to build it out the right way or the bandwidth or whatever else, right? It's like
Right.
having the discipline to be like laser focused and like let's get these few things right,
Totally.
right?
I
So
know
they're like
there
really good.
100%. And that's where my co-founder, I feel super lucky to have a co-founder that has that background in product because he's been awesome at having that laser focused vision. And it really is just balance at this point between like, okay, what do we really think the space needs? And what do we know in our gut and just from some of the authority that we've already built up, but then also really just listening to your customers, right? And if you can kind of correlate on those two factors as best as possible, that's led us straight so far. So hopefully we'll be able to keep doing it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So are you bootstrapped or did you take on funding? Or what's the strategy there? How are you going to continue to build out the
Yeah, a little
company?
bit of both, a little bit of
Okay,
both.
cool.
We've done a little bit of both. We're trying to stay as scrappy as possible. To your point earlier, I think that honestly, we've just surrounded ourselves with some really awesome strategic folks, and they have helped us accelerate past a lot of our early milestones. And so we're just going to keep doing that and seeing where it leads us.
All right, cool. So do you see not trying to push you on this, but like do you see fundraising in the near future or like are you I mean as you're going to try to stay scrappy or are you going to at some point do you see
I
yourself
think,
like
yeah, I mean,
accelerating growth?
I think like any smart entrepreneur, I think that fundraising is always on in the future. I think I'm always building those relationships and
Yeah.
thinking about it. But right now we're just super laser focused on sales and product.
That's really cool. Nice, nice. Well, this has been a really fun conversation. I love the product idea. I think it's becoming like more and more relevant. And I think the ICP, like what you're discussing, is like the perfect place to start. It's just like when you're explaining it, it just makes a lot of sense to me. It's like right where companies really have the budget and the focus to start doing this, right?
Yeah,
They've been successful enough to get to that point, right?
yeah,
And then
absolutely.
I could definitely see the enterprise application, right? Like once you build out more of like the product roadmap and feature set and like can start to push up market incrementally. And um, I see a huge opportunity there. Like, yeah, I think that that's going to play very well at some point in the Fortune 500 market. Like is there any kind of like competitor out there that's really crushing it at a mid-market enterprise level or are y'all kind of
Um,
like the first ones doing this?
It depends how you look at it. Not the answer is there's no like huge like prevalent winner in the space yet. Again, I think a big part of that is timing. We're really fortunate and we're just being good entrepreneurs at looking at this is the right time to be building this product.
Yeah, I agree.
There've been some like donation platforms, et cetera, that have started to think about this, but really not really solving that pain point of like that infrastructure layer. It's more so from like an angle of donations, et cetera, which I think is important, but I think it's just a different entry point.
Yeah, I think so. I think you have to tie it to business outcomes to sell like large subscriptions to big companies, right? Like,
yeah,
there has to be that
for
element
the
too.
first time that finally makes sense, right? I think that story might not have made sense 2 or 3 years ago when those companies were started, right? And I think people are finally ready to really think about it like that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's perfect timing. So I'm really pumped to see how your team continues to scale and grow, and I'll be rooting for you. And obviously if I can make any intros for you, just let me know. I'm actually like part of my basically my role now is like talking with founders, CEOs, executives, and venture capitalists. And that's literally like all I do. So if there's ever like any kind of intros I can make for your team, I'd love to as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, James. I appreciate that. And when y'all become a Fortune 500 or even before, we'll come help you out with your ERGs.
Oh, it's gonna happen. Just watch us. We're gonna be scaling rapidly. So my goal is to get us to like 200-300 people over the next couple of years. So
perfect. Well, you know who to talk to and you start to found some communities.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. I'm excited for that. Well, anyways, hey, one last question. Are you gonna be at Dreamforce this week?
This week we're not gonna be at Dreamforce. We were thinking about it, but I don't think we'll be able to make it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess I could have asked you that after we stopped doing the show. Anyways, well, yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining us. If people want to follow you online, where can they find you?
Yeah, so the best place is really LinkedIn. You can find us on our LinkedIn page, Verbate, Verbate. And then I'm on all the things personally as well, Anisha Nandi at LinkedIn or Twitter, all that good stuff.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for joining us and for everybody tuning in. Thank you. And we're looking forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Great chatting.